Carbohydrates are one of the four major groups of organic molecules important to biota. They are a fundamental source of energy for most organisms, typically occurring in grains, rice, sugars. In fact, they're sugar-based, and we often call them saccharides. Carbohydrates can occur as a monosaccharide, which is a single monomer, a disaccharide, which is two monomers bonded together, and as polysaccharides, the polymer of carbohydrates, which are many sugar molecules bonded together. Now, carbohydrates get their name from the fact that carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen occur in a typical ratio. So using glucose here, C6H12O6, we see that for every carbon atom, we also get 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Thus, the carbo portion of the name comes from the presence of the carbon, and the hydrate portion of the name comes from the ratio of typically 1 water molecule for every carbon atom. Carbohydrates are hydrophilic. So take a moment, pause the video, and answer these 2 questions based on your knowledge of hydrophilic. Carbohydrates, are they soluble in water, and are they polar? Okay, if you answered yes to are they soluble, you are correct, because that is what hydrophilic means, water loving, and thus they dissolve in water. And that also means that in fact they are polar. To be soluble in water, you must have polar bonds. So let's take a moment to explore that. Using glucose again as our model carbohydrate, which is the most common monosaccharide. First of all, we see that in chemist notation, they typically leave the carbons out of these types of representations. So notice that those are carbons at those meeting places of the lines there. Now focus on how many oxygens there are. Notice that all of these are carbon to oxygen bonds, and those bonds are polar because of that electronegativity of the oxygen. And thus, if the molecule has many polar bonds, it will dissolve in water because water is polar. Now we're going to be representing glucose as just this green hexagon as we go on. Monosaccharides are the monomers of carbohydrates, the individual repeating subunits, and they can occur either as a ring or as a straight chain. Now the important thing about monosaccharides is they are immediate sources of energy. They can be taken up directly across the bloodstream and used to create ATP, the energy molecule, rather quickly. If they're not needed, they will be converted to fat. Glucose, again a very important monomer, is created by photosynthetic organisms. This is the product of photosynthesis by plants. Now there are other forms, other monomers that are the same C6H12O6 formula as glucose, just a slightly different structure. Fructose is often found as a sugar in plants, and galactose is often metabolized by animals. Now, disaccharides are a special case where we have 2 monosaccharides bonded together. And they're important because in this way, being bonded together like that makes them a little harder to hydrolyze or harder to get at than if glucose was traveling freely. So they're an important form of transport of glucose through organisms. And that glucose then would be made available by finally hydrolyzing these disaccharides where they're needed. Sucrose is the combination of glucose and fructose. This is the form of carbohydrate typically transported around plant materials. Lactose is a combination of a glucose monomer and a galactose monomer. This is milk sugar created by animals to feed their young. And maltose is just simply 2 glucose molecules bonded together and often is used in beer and wine making through fermentation. Yeast cells will metabolize maltose, creating ethyl alcohol. Finally, polysaccharides are these long polymers consisting of many monosaccharides bonded together. And there are 2 roles for polysaccharides we want to explore here. Short-term energy storage roles, and then also being used as a structural component of cells. Now focusing on the energy storage forms, there are 2 major kinds, starch and glycogen, and they both take on this appearance to the left where you see a coiled chain of glucose monomers. Starch is made by plants and stored in the roots for energy purposes used later on. Glycogen is our sort of animal starch. When we don't make starch, we make glycogen, and that is stored in our liver and in our skeletal muscles to be used at a later time. The structural molecules include cellulose, and arguably the most abundant carbohydrate on the planet. This is a component of cell walls and is very strong. It's undigestible by animals. Cellulose, you can see here at the bottom, is composed of these linear sheets of glucose monomers that have extensive hydrogen bonding because of that structure. And all of those hydrogen bonds there lend themselves to a very strong material. Chitin is also a very strong structural carbohydrate that we find in the seed coats of plants to resist fungal attack, and also in the exoskeleton of arthropods, like you can see in this cicada here molting out of its exoskeleton as it grows.